Sometimes I can handle being beaten by my child at something, like when I'm trying my hardest. But most of the time I can't. It's hard. Welcome back, everyone, to the Balance for Life podcast. We are here to help you find happiness and success in your life through a balance in all things.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you like what you hear or what you see, hit that like button, review, give us a 5-star review, follow, share, comment, do all the things. We've actually been getting a few messages on Instagram and comments and stuff, so that's been really cool. We try and respond, try and chat with people. We've had a few people that have suggested not topics, but guests.
Oh, okay.
Or people that have said that they would be willing to come on and be guests. So maybe
we need to figure out guests, because I think that would be really cool.
Yeah,
we could have someone here, but if we did like a call or something, I have to figure out the logistics.
Yeah. So those of you that have reached out about guest hosting, we're still working on that. Hopefully soon we'll come up with a solution.
Yeah.
Don't forget to join us as well on social media. We just mentioned Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, all at Balance for Life, number 4. We're at Twitter at Adam and Perry, all spelled out, and then on YouTube just search Balance number 4 Life,
and you'll find us.
So, yeah, I think we've got a great episode today. Yeah. I really like this one. I think it's an important thing today to talk about. Mm-hmm. So what we're going to talk about today is why it's important to not compare your own grief to others.
Yeah, exactly. So
good stuff.
So let me tell a story about what prompted this episode idea. So I've shared this before, but if it's your first time watching, my wife and I lost a child about 6 years ago. Yeah. She was 1.5 years and just passed away unexpectedly in her sleep. No known cause of death. It was just they call it SIDS if it's before a year old. They call it SUDC. I think it's sudden unexplained death in childhood or something like that if they're 1 year old or older. And obviously that was super devastating, really difficult and challenging thing, something that you don't really overcome fully all the way. I mean, it's part of you the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. But I think my wife and I have both done a really good job at navigating through grief together. We've grown closer together because of it. But it's a part of our life, right? Yeah. So a few years ago, probably maybe 3-4 years ago, I had a coworker who knew about this, and their oldest daughter is named Avery, and our youngest daughter's named Avery, and they're 1 day apart. So they were born 1 day apart, which was really cool. So, good friend of mine, and they had a miscarriage, a couple of years after Avery's were born. And I remember I was just talking to him about it and expressing my condolences, and he's talking about how hard it was, and then he said something like, "Man, I shouldn't even complain to you about how hard this is. It's nothing compared to what you've gone through." And I thought that was really interesting, and I don't remember exactly what I said, but I said something like, "Look, your loss is still loss, even if it's different than my loss, right?" And sure, like I think losing a 1.5-year-old is probably harder than having a miscarriage. I've never, Rachel never had a miscarriage. But I have sisters who have had miscarriages. I know that it can be really hard. Yeah. And so I think it's important to not invalidate your own grief, your own loss, suffering, trials, pain, just because somebody else has it harder than you, right? We all experience loss and trials, and it is okay to feel grief and to go, to feel sadness and navigate through grief. So that's why I wanted to talk about this today.
Yeah, and I can't even imagine. I mean, that would just be unfathomably difficult to navigate through. But I agree with you. I think that's a really important way to look at it, and I think many of us know somebody, or possibly some of you yourselves have experienced the loss of a child. or a miscarriage or something
Or
like
loss
that.
of a spouse or
Loss of a
sibling.
spouse,
Yeah.
loss of a sibling, loss of a parent. We've all experienced loss at some point, and I think one of the things that kind of is going through my mind as you're talking about your story is we all deal with it in different ways, right? I know we've talked about this quite a few times, and you've mentioned how you've been through therapy groups and Facebook groups of people that have had similar experiences, and a lot of times it can destroy relationships. It ruins marriages. It can destroy a person, and you personally have used it as a way to strengthen your relationship, and I think that's awesome. Like kudos to you. But I think it's just important to remember that everybody handles grief in different ways, and so to somebody, right, losing a child is just unimaginable. Where to another person, it might be not quite as devastating. I don't know if that's the right way to put it.
Yeah.
But I think it's important that we recognize that everybody handles grief differently, and I think that's how we deal with it. Is we talk about it, we share it with people, and recognizing that, hey, I may have lost something, but you've lost something too, and having that compassion is a good way to help people navigate through that grief.
Yeah. Another example that I've witnessed or read other people on Facebook talk about, it's so frustrating when people do this. Sometimes people will say something like, I'm so sorry that you lost your child, my dog passed away and that was so hard. And when you've lost a child, you don't want to hear about how somebody's losing their pet is similar. Now, at the same time, I think it's important to validate that losing a pet is really difficult, right? It's just, I think people say something like that with good intentions. But I think what's important is if somebody is expressing their loss, what they really want you to do is just listen and let them know that must be super hard. I'm here for you. Let me know what I can do to help. Let me bring you dinner. Whatever. Like that's really what someone needs. Not, oh, I know how you feel because So I try to do this whenever someone talks about something they're grieving. I try not to tell them something like, oh, I know how you feel. I've experienced. There are situations where I think that's appropriate, but you just have to be really careful doing that.
Yeah. So I think it's. I guess what I'm trying to put together right now is there's. It's almost like there's two different things that we're approaching with this topic. Where one of them is you can't ever compare your own grief with somebody else's. But at the same time, you never want to compare somebody else's grief to your own.
Right.
And I think a lot of times we as humans, in order to show sympathy, we want to express how we can relate to that person. Yeah. And like you said, I think there's a time and a place for that, but I don't necessarily think it's always appropriate to do that. I think sometimes the best way to show compassion, the best way to help somebody is just shut your mouth and listen, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. I think so often we, and I've been learning a lot about active listening, and so often we listen with the intention of responding, and we're trying to formulate our next thought, and we're trying to formulate our response while the other person is talking, and we kind of neglect what they're expressing.
Right.
And so I think it's important that we allow everybody to experience their own grief and not compare our own to somebody else's, but not compare other people to ourselves either.
I think me personally, if somebody, if I'm talking with somebody about how I lost a child and they say, oh my gosh, I lost a child too. I'm so sorry that you also had to experience that. To me, that feels like a really appropriate response. It's something that we, it is really similar. Now, they might have passed away a different way. Maybe the circumstances were different. But it's just when you're like, oh yeah, I lost my dog. It's just like, that's not the same thing. But I feel like that is something appropriate for us to talk about at some point. But like, don't try to hijack what we're talking about right now. So it's just something that you should be careful about. I try to just feel out, like, is it appropriate for me to right now share, hey, this is the loss I experienced. I know how you feel, because that can be really powerful.
Mhm.
Right? Like, I've experienced something really similar to you. We have this bond now,
Mhm.
right? So you just have to be careful. Like, if it's something on a totally different level, maybe it's not going to help right now, and just listening is important.
Yeah.
But if it's like really similar, then maybe that can be helpful. Something that you're able to, if I know, oh wow, you've experienced the same thing as me, that gives me comfort knowing that somebody else, maybe years before me, has experienced that and managed to go through it. But that's why you have group therapy. I mean, group therapy can be really helpful, because you hear about, well, this is how my child passed away 10 years ago. And for us, it was like 2 months ago. And look, they've gotten to this point. Okay, I can do that too.
Right.
So there's a time and a place for it.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Well, and I think talking about the group therapy sessions, right? It's a way that you can maybe take from the experiences of other people
Mhm.
and say, oh, these people lost a child 10 years ago. This is how they've navigated through that. Maybe something that they have done can help me.
Exactly.
So I think that's important to keep in mind.
I think it's also important to recognize that grief doesn't just come when somebody dies.
Yeah.
Okay, there are lots of things that we grieve, sometimes on a really small scale,
Mhm.
and sometimes on a large scale. So
Yeah.
when a loved one passes away, that's more on a large scale. Okay, if you lose your job, that's a pretty big deal, but it's also something that, in most scenarios, like, you can overcome,
Mhm.
and you can get through that a little bit easier than losing a loved one, right?
Right.
And then maybe you lost your wallet, like I talked about last week, right?
Yeah.
Like, I experienced grief at losing my wallet and the $20 that were in there.
Maybe a storm came and just about shut down your farmer's market business, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think we all experience different things, and grief comes in all shapes and sizes.
Exactly.
And so when we talk about grief, we're not just talking about grieving the loss of a loved one. It could be loss of a job. It could be losing your keys, right?
Yeah.
Losing your keys and that frustration,
Mhm.
right? We're still calling that grief.
Mhm.
So
Exactly.
yeah, it's important to recognize those emotions that are associated with it.
Yep. So as we're going through the next part of this episode, keep that in mind, that you have something that you have grieved or are grieving, even if you didn't realize it. And so I think this can help and apply to a lot of different scenarios. So we're going to talk about the stages of grief really briefly, and I think that a lot of people are aware of these, but maybe not everyone. So
I think they're fairly commonly known.
Yeah.
For the most part, but yeah, there might be a few things in there that we can help somebody to recognize.
I learned about these when our daughter passed away, but I recognized there were things I had gone through this process of these stages of grief many times before in my life on a smaller scale.
Yep.
So the first one is denial, and I also want to point out these stages can take a few seconds, a few years. You can be in a stage of grief for your whole life, where you can cycle through these stages over and over.
And they don't have to and they don't have to go in a specific order either.
Right.
You can go from one to another one and back again.
It's true, you can, yeah.
So, yeah.
So this is like the typical order that you'll go through, but it can vary, and you can go backwards, for sure. So denial is the first one. So you have this, like, I can't believe this happened to me, like, this didn't actually happen, I'm dreaming, just why would this happen to me? You just have this denial about what you're actually grieving.
Yeah, and I think if we are talking about loss of a loved one, right, it could be I remember when my grandma passed away. It was not quite a year ago. And I remember finding out that she was going downhill, and it was kind of that she was almost, she was 97 when she died, almost 98. And finding out that she was going downhill, even up until mid-90s. I mean, this woman was amazing and sharp as a tack. I mean, she had 12 kids, all married with kids of their own. She had 53 grandkids, 100 and I don't even 20 something great grandkids, and still growing, and several great grandkids. And so we would have family reunions, family gatherings with 200 plus people, and it was not uncommon for us. And every single one of those people, not only did she know your names, she knew birthdays, she knew something about you. Like I remember when we did our brickvertising.
Yeah.
I walked into her house like a couple of days later, and she said, I need to talk to you about something. I said, oh boy. And she let me have it.
Why are you throwing bricks through
she let me
cars?
have it about throwing a brick through somebody's car window. And so it's, I mean, it
was about to, just so everyone knows, this car didn't work and was about to be taken to the junkyard.
It was our car.
We had permission. Yeah, exactly. Like it was the drummer's car that was about to go to the junkyard.
So that was just the kind of person that she was. And I remember finding out that she was not doing well. She was starting to slip, and it wasn't going to be long. And it was that there is no way that this woman who's been there my whole life, who still, like my kids get $5 bills. Every single person in the family would get a $5 bill for their birthday and get Christmas money. And it wasn't on your birthday or after your birthday. It was 3 days before your birthday that envelope would come. And so that denial was, it started early.
Started before she passed away. That can happen.
Before she passed away from me, where it was, there's no way. Right. And I think a lot of times when we're not there every single day and we don't see it happening, it's that denial is just kind of like, oh, there's no way, right? Last time I saw her, she was great, and that was a week ago. So I think that denial is probably because a lot of times in these situations we are somewhat detached. Can happen earlier, and sometimes you might be there every single day. It might be the loss of a child, it might be the loss of a spouse, where you see them every single day, and then one day they're just gone. And that denial takes the form of, they're still here, right? You wake up the next day and you go into their room to pick them up and hold them or whatever. So that's a denial stage, and I think that's a tough one to go through.
But it is an appropriate response to losing someone, and it's okay to feel that. All of these are okay to move through and to feel.
Absolutely. So. I think that's something else that we can mention too. We talked last week about emotions and acknowledging and feeling those emotions, and all of these responses to grief are appropriate. And it's okay to feel these feelings. It's okay to allow these feelings to happen. And so the next stage of grief I think that we can talk about is anger. I think that's an easy one for most people. When it comes to grief, when it comes to loss of any kind, I think anger is one that probably most everybody experiences quite heavily throughout the process of their grief.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a normal part of grief, but it's not fun. It's not a fun feeling. And that anger can be directed towards so many different things, and it can seem unrelated too. So when our daughter passed away, I experienced anger at God for letting it happen. I experienced anger at myself for not preventing it somehow, anger at my daughter for dying, right? Like it's when you say it out loud, it kind of sounds like, how could you feel that way? But it's a normal feeling when you experience the loss of someone. It's just totally normal, and it's something you have to feel and you have to work through.
And I think it's important too that we talk about that anger can be released in sometimes maybe not appropriate ways as well. I think, like you said, you can feel that anger towards anything, and it's may not even be necessarily related, but it could just make you more on edge, and so more irritable. So little things maybe that your other kids were doing were more frustrating, more irritating, or things that were happening at work could be more anger triggering. And so I think that's something too that we need to watch out for, is allowing those feelings, but recognizing maybe we need to find an appropriate outlet.
Exactly. That's really important, because it is natural and normal to feel anger as part of these stages of grief. It's not okay or appropriate to express that anger in an inappropriate way.
Yeah.
It's not appropriate to express it in an inappropriate way, okay?
Right. Exactly.
So, anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, therapy can really help with that. That's how my wife and I learned how to appropriately take action when we felt certain things and how to move through grief. We needed professional help, and sometimes you need that, and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
The next stage is bargaining. And I think out of all the stages, this is probably where I have spent the most time over the last 6 years. That's kind of slowly like subsided, but I still come back to sometimes. And it's this idea that maybe somehow you can change it, or you're almost like thinking, no, it didn't really happen. It's kind of similar to denial, but you replay like these what if scenarios. So, for example, our daughter Avery was born about a year after Blakely passed away. And we were kind of paranoid. So we bought an Owlet monitor. So, it's this little sock that goes on their foot, monitors their heart rate, their oxygen levels, and it alerts you if something's not within normal levels. And then we used the Nebo after a few months, switched to that. But both of them were really helpful. But I would constantly think, man, if I could just go back in time and tell my former self, like, buy one of these monitors, so that way, like, we would have been alerted and we could have gone and, prevented it from happening.
Yeah.
Right? And you just replay that in your mind so much sometimes. So that, for me, that was like where I spent a lot of my grief, was in that stage.
Yeah. Well, and I think, like you said, it's kind of that what if scenarios, right? I remember, let's see, it's been over 10 years. It's probably been 12 or 13 years ago. I lost a good friend from high school. And I remember I found out about it. He passed away Easter weekend. And I found out about it, it was like Saturday or Sunday. And it was a day or two after. But I remember we were driving. We lived in northern Utah at the time. We were driving to my parents' house in Springville. And I remember driving through and past where his apartment was. And I remember thinking to myself, it's been a little bit. I need to call and check up on him, see how he's doing, right? And so we drove past, and I didn't, and got to my parents' house that weekend, and I got the phone call. It was like that night or the next night that he had passed. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking to myself, if I had been a better friend, right? If I had made that phone call, if I had kept in touch more closely, right? Because it had been several years since high school, and we'd kind of lost touch, but we'd still see each other somewhat regularly, at least a couple of times a year, and we talked. And so it was kind of one of those, maybe if I had been a better friend, he'd still be here.
Right.
And if I had made that call, maybe he wouldn't have made the choices that ended up taking his life.
Yeah.
So I think it's
a natural feeling to feel. It's a natural part of grief. Again, it's something that you have to work through, and you have to get to the point where you realize, I can't go back and change the past. And it's very possible that anything I could have done wouldn't have changed the outcome. Yeah. Like, we don't know, right? Same with your friend, right? Like, maybe if you had been a better friend, it still might have happened. Maybe if we had had a monitor on our child, she still might have passed away. There still might have been nothing we could do about it.
Exactly.
Right? So it's okay to feel those feelings, but you have to get to the point where you realize what's happened has happened. There's nothing I can do to change it.
Right. And I think, I think that takes us into another
Stage.
One of the stages that we'll talk about in just a few minutes, but being able to accept that they're really, you can't control the situation. Right. I mean, maybe buying a monitor would have changed the situation for you, and losing your daughter, maybe it wouldn't have. Maybe me being a better friend would have changed the situation, maybe it wouldn't have. It's completely out of our control. And again, it's perfectly natural to feel that bargaining stage. And I think that's where a lot of people get trapped. And I think that's also a stage where you get to this concept of take me instead. Yeah. Right? Why did it have to be my daughter? Why couldn't it have been me? I've lived my life. Right. Or most of it. Right? I've been here a lot longer. I've experienced what I need to experience in this life. take me instead.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of people get trapped in this bargaining
Yeah.
stage. And so, yeah, it's important to understand that it is appropriate to feel these feelings, but we need to not let them take control. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah,
So-
exactly.
And I think when we do let them take control, that kind of takes us into the next stage
hmm
of grief, is depression.
Yeah.
Um,
Which is another stage that I think a lot of people get trapped in.
and I think that's where you see a lot of drug abuse,
Mhm.
and alcoholism, and things like that, where people just want to cover up the hurt.
hmm
They want to cover up the sadness, the depression.
And so, one of the things that's important to do in this stage is, again, recognize the way you're feeling. Okay, that it's a normal, natural part of grief. So it's okay that I feel this way. But what am I going to do to work through it?
Yeah.
Right? What appropriate, helpful things am I going to do to work through this instead of just trying to mask it?
Right.
And so recognizing, hey, it is okay to play video games. Right? I just can't do it all day, every day.
Yeah.
Right? Or it is okay if you drink alcohol. Maybe it is okay to have a little bit if you're able to without becoming addictive. So for
Right.
some people that might be okay, and for some it might not be.
Right.
Actually, probably with anything. Like for some people, video games might not be
Mm-hmm.
okay because they are going to, that's
Yeah.
all they're going to do, and they're just going to waste away their day and lose their job or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So it's finding what works for you that you're not going to use as a crutch. That's just going to help you get through it.
Yeah. And I mean, we talk about crutches, alcohol, drugs, negative things are not the only necessarily things that you could lean on. I mean, some people deal with grief by just exercising constantly,
hmm
right? And
Too much, right?
yeah, they spend 8 hours plus a day in the gym, and they lose sight of everything else, and they're using it to when you use something to cover up another emotion, that's when it becomes a problem.
Right, exactly. So finding activities that you can do, things that help you, that you're able to moderate
Mhm.
fairly easily, and using those things. Now, when we talk about drugs, there are some drugs that are, prescribed that
Yeah.
can help you, and, so Prozac might be what you need.
Yeah.
Right?
Some people, when you go to therapy, when you go to talk about these issues, you might need something to boost your mood, to elevate you, to get you through that stage.
Mhm.
And that's okay. But overusing it is when we come into a problem.
Yep, exactly.
Yep.
And then the final stage of grief is acceptance. And sometimes we get to this stage and we feel like we've accepted it, and then we go through the stages again. Like I think, especially when you lose someone really close to you,
Yeah.
you're going to go through the stages of grief your whole life. It might be more mild, and you might kind of go through them faster instead of spending months in depression. Maybe it's just a couple days,
Yeah.
right? And so, I still go through these stages. But acceptance is where you get to that point where, okay, I realize there's nothing I can do to change it. There's nothing I can do about it. I still need to live my life. I still need to be there for my spouse, for my other children.
Mhm.
I still need to have a job and provide. Maybe I don't want to, but I have to do that, right? Like,
Yeah.
you get to the point where you accept that you have to still be a person. You still
Yeah.
have to exist and live and try to do your best.
Yeah. And I also want to point out with this, though, acceptance doesn't necessarily mean that you don't feel the pain anymore.
Right, exactly.
I think so often people think that years down the road that it's going to be gone,
Right.
that it's no longer going to hurt. And I'm sure, again, losing a child, I can't even imagine. Losing a friend, losing a grandparent, losing a parent, losing a loved one of any kind. I know me and my wife have talked about this because we've lost almost all of our grandparents
Mhm.
to this point, and we spent a lot of time with our grandparents growing up. And even though we've gotten to a point where we can accept that they're gone, as I'm sure you've lost your parent, you've lost a child, you've lost grandparents, even though you get to that point where you accept that they're gone and you move on with your life and you're still going through, there are still times, and there are still, it might be a Christmas party, and you remember how they would do things, or you might remember certain things, or something might stimulate a response where you still feel that hurt, and years down the road it might still be just as fresh as it was the day it happened.
Yeah.
So acceptance, I think it's important to say that acceptance doesn't mean that it's gone.
Right, exactly.
Right. The hurt will always be there, and there's always going to be that sadness, and that's okay.
Mhm.
And that's another one of those things where you can't allow that to bring you back into this spiral
Right,
of negativity.
right. Exactly. Yeah, yesterday I was listening to some music and the song came on that I used to sing to Blakely as a lullaby.
Mm.
And I don't have those moments as often anymore, but it was one of those where it kind of took me back and I, felt some sadness and
Yeah.
some longing and I was able to work through and process those emotions. And I think it's just important to get to the point where, okay, I can work through it when those
Mhm.
things happen. It's not debilitating
Yeah.
anymore. Right?
Maybe that's the acceptance part,
Yeah.
isn't necessarily that you don't feel the hurt anymore, or that you just move on with life and forget about it. It's
Yeah.
just that you learn to cope with the emotion, you learn to cope with the pain, and
Yeah.
you learn to work through those
Exactly.
responses.
So I think let's talk about when is it appropriate to compare ourselves to others.
Yeah.
I think we already mentioned earlier that knowing that someone else has gone through something similar can help us to feel like there's someone who can relate. And
Right.
that can be helpful. Okay, so I think that's totally appropriate. That's okay.
Mhm.
Thinking, oh, their loss isn't as big of a deal as mine, so why are they upset about it? I think is something that we might naturally feel, but that we should try to avoid and work through and get
Yeah.
past. Or thinking, oh, their loss is worse than mine. I shouldn't be feeling this bad about my loss,
Mm-hmm.
right? Your loss is
Yeah.
appropriate.
Your loss is valid.
It's valid, yeah.
Everybody
happened.
experiences grief for lots of different reasons, and whatever it is, your grief is valid.
Mhm.
And I think that's kind of the key there, is recognizing that you are an individual and your response is going to be different than somebody else's, no matter what the case is.
Mhm.
So yeah, there's going to be times when you relate to that person, and I think relating your experience is different than comparing.
Mhm.
So yeah, maybe that's where it is it's not
Yeah.
necessarily comparing, it's giving that person something that they can relate to.
Exactly.
So they can say, okay, you've experienced this before. How did you get through it?
Mhm.
How can you help me? Right.
Yeah. You're
Or
connecting.
yeah.
Or I've been through something similar. I'm happy to share
yeah.
my thoughts if you want. I'm happy to help you through this
Yeah.
process.
So I think it just takes emotional intelligence. It's a good book. But I think it just takes recognizing, reading the situation, right? Reading your audience, knowing, okay, this person lost somebody yesterday, right?
Mhm.
Today's probably not the day to talk about my loss
Mhm.
and what they need to do to work their way through it, right?
Mhm.
I think sometimes that comes across very abrasive
Yeah.
and callous and unfeeling, right?
Right.
It's not compassion, it's not sympathy. Weeks down the road, when they come to you and say, okay, I'm feeling this right now, it's very difficult for me, I know you lost somebody. Or even if they don't say that, I think it's appropriate sometimes to say, I understand how you're feeling, I've experienced something similar, can I help you in any way? Is there anything I can do for you?
Yeah.
And having those kind of responses, I think, is a good thing. So being able to understanding the best way to approach that situation,
Mhm.
I think is good too.
So when Blakely passed away, we had a neighbor. They had lost a child, I think, at birth.
Okay.
And so one of the things he did that I felt like was a really good way to approach it was he said, hey, I've been there. My experience is a little bit different. Here's what happened to me. And they gave us like this teddy bear that they would use to hold, that their other kids would hold, So it's like, hey, we feel like we've gotten the use out of this that we needed. And then, our son slept with it for a while. And it was a really touching gesture. And then one of the things he offered me that I never ended up taking him up on was, hey, if you ever want to go out to Soda with me and just talk about it, I'm happy to. But he presented it in a way as like, I understand if you don't, but I'm here for you.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really great gesture. Just of, I think it's the right way to approach it, right? Like, hey, I can to a certain extent understand what you're going through. I'm here to talk if you need somebody. Instead of like, hey, let's talk about it. This is what like you don't force it.
Yeah, maybe that's the more appropriate thing, is just recognizing, okay, I'm gonna let you know that I'm available, and put the ball in your court, as it were.
Yeah.
And allow you to grieve and be sympathetic. Talking about not necessarily comparing, but relating to other people. And I think we've touched on group therapy, right? Where you're in a group with people who have been in similar situations and are at different stages in the grieving process. And so surrounding yourself with people who are actively going through the same thing that you're going through, and knowing that everybody in this room is in that same situation, I think that's a good place where you can go and openly share your own experience and where you're at in the grieving process and how you've gone through it. And there's always going to be some people in that room who are farther along in their grieving process than you that you can learn from. And there are going to be people in that room who are just starting on their grieving process, or who are farther behind on their grieving process who you can help. And so I think it's important, when we talk about relating to other people, surround yourself with other people. You don't want to dwell on that negative emotion, but putting yourself into those situations with other people that you know have been there. And
exactly. I think both of those are important, because you can learn from others, but helping somebody else actually helps you also. And I think you said this in a previous episode, something like, what you give to the universe, you get back in return, right? Twofold, tenfold, whatever, right? And so helping other people helps you heal at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, that was a great topic. Hopefully you cried a little bit, or, learned something that you can use to navigate through whatever grief you're dealing with. Our weekly challenge is to think about something that you are grieving. I bet you most people right now are grieving something. Okay? Whether you realize it or not. So the challenge is to figure out, what are you grieving right now, and recognize what stage you're in. So maybe you've been feeling angry lately, and you might realize, you know what, it's because so-and-so passed away. Maybe it's not even someone you're that close to, so you don't think about grieving, but you still might be grieving. So that's our challenge.
I think that's an awesome challenge. Because a lot of times recognizing, accepting, acknowledging is the first step to solution.
Right? Exactly.
I think that's an awesome challenge. So thank you again for listening. Thanks for watching. Like Perry said, I think this was a really great episode. Probably the most emotional one we've had so far. And
I think we both teared up a couple times.
So awesome stuff. I loved it. Don't forget, if you like what you heard, leave us a 5-star review. If you don't like what you heard, maybe give us some commentary on that as well. Help us to improve.
And we are trying to release episodes weekly, so look for those on Mondays. That's our goal. And
on Spotify, iTunes, Google, Amazon, YouTube, pretty much anywhere. I think there might be a few obscure platforms that we're not on, but all the main ones. All the main ones, we're going to be there.
We look forward to talking with you again next week.
We'll see you.